Out of all the major recruiting sites, I always thought that ESPN was the worst. It kind of felt lazy, it didn't feel updated, and there was typically a huge difference between them and other sites. Still though, it had me intrigued. Who did they have as the top ranked quarterback in each and every high school class? That was a question I was pondering a couple days ago, so I decided to look through it myself, and today we're going to talk about just that. Since the start of 2010, we're going to go through each and every number one quarterback and talk about what happened to them, who they were, and why they were ranked so highly. But before we get started with today's video, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about what happened to every number one quarterback recruit since 2010. So I guess we're going to end up starting in 2023, and ESPN's number one quarterback was Malachi Nelson. He ended up growing up in Los Alamitos, California, where he was seen as a big-time player from the very beginning. When he was in 8th grade, he was getting scholarship offers, and he eventually took over at Los Alamitos High School and became an absolute stud. He eventually became a 5-star recruit and had an absolutely loaded high school career. He ended up becoming the 2022 Gatorade Player of the Year in the state of California, as he threw for 2,898 yards with 35 touchdowns. He put up big numbers all 4 years of high school, and eventually committed to play for USC. He was seen as the next big thing, and the likely next great quarterback in line for USC. After Caleb Williams went off to the NFL, Malachi was going to be next. Except that's not how it's panned out so far. Malachi Nelson pretty much did nothing in his first year at USC, as he in total completed one pass. Instead, Miller Moss got the start in their bowl game, and Malachi Nelson would end up entering the transfer portal. He decided to transfer over to Boise State, so he went from a Power 5 player to a Group of 5 player. To make things even more strange, he ended up losing the starting job, and so far this season he's gone 5 of 8 for 66 yards. It's definitely been kind of disappointing, and Malachi Nelson as of now has been a big time bust. I guess speaking of bust, ESPN had Connor Weigman listed as their number one quarterback in the class of 2022. After coming out of Cypress, Texas, Weigman would blow up as a junior and ended up getting offers from every school in the country. There was a time in which people thought he'd end up going to Texas, but apparently he fell in love with Texas A&M. Alongside his friend LJ Johnson, they would both commit to the Aggies. He had over 2,900 total yards and 34 touchdowns as a senior, and ended up becoming one of the best quarterbacks in the state of Texas. He was a 5-star, and then as a freshman, he'd play in their final 4 games, making his first career start against Ole Miss, and he set a true freshman record with 338 yards in that game. He ended up having a solid end of the season, and then in 2023, he'd start their first 4 games before he would suffer a season-ending injury. Going into 2024, Weigman's film was apparently so good that he was seen as a top 10 pick. It was time for him to finally put it all together under Mike Elko, but he ended up having a putrid performance against Notre Dame, got hurt, and has now probably lost the job to Marcel Reed. I have no idea what to think of Weigman at this point, but it's safe to say he has sort of been a bust right now. Also, be sure to check out my video I recently did on him if you want a full documentary on his career. Speaking of guys who were injured, Quinn Ewers was the number one quarterback in the class of 2021 according to ESPN. That would have looked slightly different had he stayed in the class of 2022, but he was a 2021 kid. Ewers ended up being born in the state of Texas and eventually went to Carroll High School. As a 6th grader, he was offered his first scholarship offer by Graham Harrell, and then as a sophomore, he blew up nationally, throwing for nearly 4,000 yards and 45 touchdowns. He was seen as the next prodigy quarterback coming out of Southlake Carroll High School, and ended up doing so well that he was able to reclassify. Originally, he decided to commit to Texas, but after thinking things through, he would decide to actually flip to Ohio State. He became the number one quarterback in the class of 2021 and did nothing his first year at Ohio State. He decided to redshirt and then would go back to Texas in 2022. He ended up starting a couple of games, but also would get hurt, and in 10 games, threw for 2,100 yards with 15 touchdowns and 6 picks. In 2023, Ewers had his best season yet, throwing for nearly 3,500 yards and 22 touchdowns, but more importantly, he got them into the college football playoff, where they lost by an eyelash to Washington. He decided to come back in 2024 instead of going off to the NFL, and so far this season, he has 691 yards and 8 touchdowns, but suffered an injury against UTSA, and Arch Manning's had to come in since. Quinn Ewers is a legitimate Heisman contender, is probably a first-round pick, and has definitely lived up to being the number one quarterback in the country. In 2020, ESPN had Bryce Young listed as the number one quarterback in the class. That was for good reason. After growing up in Philadelphia, he would eventually move across the country and would attend Cathedral High School and then Mater Dei High School. He would follow in the footsteps of JT Daniels and ended up becoming the Gatorade Football Player of the Year after throwing for 4,500 yards and 58 touchdowns. He originally committed to play at USC, but would later flip to Alabama and Nick Saban near signing day, and this was a huge deal. In total, he had 13,000 yards and 152 touchdowns to his name, and when he got to Bama, he was great. He ended up being a backup to Mac Jones his first year, and then in 2021, he took over. He broke the single-season record for passing yards in their game against Arkansas, and went on to also win the Heisman and get them to the national championship, where he threw a game-sealing pick six to Keely Ringo. In 2022, he was given a ridiculous amount of hype, but he would sort of fall off a little bit. He ended up only passing for 3,300 yards with 32 touchdowns and 5 picks, and some like to blame a bad receiving core for that. Still though, he ended up becoming one of the best quarterbacks in Alabama history, if not the best, and would eventually decide to declare and became the number 1 overall pick. His childhood CJ Stroud would end up going at number 2, and many thought that Stroud should have been number 1. Bryce would go to the Panthers and ended up in a terrible situation where so far he's been a bust. He was terrible in his rookie year outside of 1 or 2 games, and this year he was so bad that he was benched in favor of a 90-year-old Andy Dalton. Part of that is due to instability and the terrible coaching staff in front of him, and part of that is I just don't think he's that good of an NFL quarterback, but Bryce Young, while he did live up to the hype coming out of high school at Bama, has been a bust in the league. It is that time of the year as winning season is back, football is back, and MyBookie is here to make sure you are ready to cash in on all the action. This season, MyBookie is pulling out all the stops with incredible promotions like a weekly risk-free boost on Thursdays where you can bet without a sweat. If your bet hits, you win big. If it doesn't, forget it. MyBookie will refund your wager. But that's just the beginning. MyBookie is giving away hundreds of thousands in prizes with their Super Survivor and Square contests. Get your entries now in for your shot at huge cash rewards. When you're ready to get started, be sure to use my promo code FISHER50 and make sure to get some extra cash on top of your first deposit. Okay, but what do you get when you use my promo code? Well, if you type in Fisher50, you'll get up to $1,000 in a welcome bonus bet, plus a $10 casino chip. MyBookie's tiered bonuses make it easy to deposit with crypto or with credit, and the bigger your deposit, the bigger your bonus. The bonus would be 100% match up to $1,000 plus a $10 casino chip. With MyBookie, you can bet on anything, anywhere, at any time, and make your season a winning season. Be sure to check out my link down below and use my promo code FISHER50. That is FISHER50. Man, ESPN really is weird with their recruiting, as in 2019 they had Graham Mertz as their number 1 quarterback. Mertz was just your average 3-star recruit for quite some time, but eventually at Bishop Miege High School, he went from a 3-star to a 5-star. He was one of the most sought-after recruits in the country, as after his senior year, he threw for 3,800 yards and 51 touchdowns. That was a Kansas high school football record, and because of that, he was the Gatorade Player of the Year. After being committed to Wisconsin, he would stick with the Badgers throughout the process, and would eventually arrive at Madison as the highest-ranked quarterback in school history. He would end up becoming the backup to Jack Cohn in 2019, but then would take over in 2020. Jack Cohn was hurt, and Mertz had one of the most incredible first games we've ever seen. He had 17 consecutive completed passes, which was a school record, and went 20 of 21 for multiple touchdown passes in a dominant 45-7 victory over Illinois. Unfortunately though, that was his best moment, as he would finish the season with a 4-3 record and 1,200 yards and 9 touchdowns and 5 picks total. In 2021, he was expected to be much better, but he didn't improve. He finished with 1,900 yards, 10 touchdowns, and 11 picks, and then in 2022, he once again had 2,100 yards, this time with 19 touchdowns and 10 picks. Mertz wasn't really getting all that much better, so he decided to go to a new system, or maybe he could be developed better. He decided to go over to Florida for a fresh start, and last season he threw for a career-high 2,900 yards and 20 touchdowns, but Florida would miss a bowl game, so everyone wrote him off. So far this year, Mertz has been a little bit underwhelming, throwing for 487 yards with 4 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, and it looks like he doesn't have that much time to save his career. Honestly, he should have never been the number 1 quarterback in the class, but he hasn't been that bad either. There have definitely been 5-stars who have busted worse than him, but he hasn't exactly been a superstar either. He's kind of just been an above-average quarterback who will be seen as a what-if. What's really weird to me is that somehow, someway, ESPN had Justin Fields ranked over Trevor Lawrence for the number 1 quarterback in the class of 2018. Fields was obviously still talented though. He ended up coming out of Kennesaw, Georgia, and would go to Harrison High School. In his last 2 years as a starter, he combined for over 6,000 yards and nearly 70 touchdowns. He ended up blossoming into a blue-chip recruit and would decide to commit to Penn State. But he blew up so much that he went so national and then flipped to Georgia near signing day. He was named Mr. Football and would arrive his first year at Georgia as the next big thing. In 2018, as a true freshman, he was a backup to Jake Fromm and didn't really get a chance to do a whole lot. In total, he threw for 328 yards and 4 touchdowns and ran for 4 more on the ground. After that, there was a questionable off-the-field incident which allowed him to transfer and get eligibility right away, and he would arrive at Ohio State, deemed as the next big thing. He'd lead the Buckeyes to a 13-1 record in his first year there, throwing for 3,200 yards with 41 touchdowns and 3 picks. Fields was as good as advertised, and he would carry that into 2020. In 8 games, he'd throw for 2,100 yards with 22 touchdowns, but ultimately his season would end on a sour note as he miscommunicated with Chris Olave and threw a game-stealing interception against Clemson. Fields would enter the 2021 NFL Draft as a future franchise quarterback and was eventually taken 11th overall by the Chicago Bears. Sadly, Fields was never really able to make it work in Chicago, as through his 3 years there, he was never really much of a passer and was more of a glorified running back who occasionally threw the ball. Okay, maybe that's a little bit harsh, but eventually Chicago decided to move in a new direction and draft Caleb Williams, and so far Justin Fields has found his new home in Pittsburgh, where he is currently starting for an injured Russell Wilson. So far he has 518 yards with 2 touchdowns, and has also ran for 90 yards and a score. Somehow though, the Steelers are 3-0, and maybe Justin Fields will save his career in Pittsburgh. We'll have to wait and see, but he definitely lived up to the hype, and did make it to the NFL and started some years, so it's hard to call him a complete bust. Ah yes, in 2017, scouts were in love with a player by the name of Hunter Johnson. I actually grew up on the north side of Indianapolis, so I heard about Hunter Johnson when I was in high school, and he was the next big thing. While he was at Brownsburg High School, which wasn't too far from me, he passed for over 6,657 yards and 69 touchdowns. He was a 4-year starter for Brownsburg and holds multiple school records and is one of the best quarterbacks in state history. He became a 5-star recruit because of his stats and measurables and would decide to commit to Tennessee. This was a huge get for the Volunteers, but he would ultimately flip to Dabo Swinney and the Clemson Tigers. He was considered the number 1 quarterback in the country according to ESPN and would arrive at Clemson in 2017. He did not redshirt his first year and began the season as a 3rd-string quarterback, but eventually became the backup to Kelly Bryant. In total, he threw for 234 yards and 2 touchdowns and would then enter the transfer portal. He would have to sit out the entirety of the 2018 season and would then start in 2019 for Pat Fitzgerald. Sadly though, it was a huge disappointment. He struggled mightily in pretty much every single way, as he threw pick after pick and didn't win a lot of games. He completed just 46% of his passes and had 432 yards with 1 touchdown and 4 picks. In his second year in 2020, Northwestern would bounce back, but it was without Hunter Johnson. They brought in former Indiana quarterback Peyton Ramsey, and Ramsey took the job. In Johnson's 3rd year, he battled it out with former blue-chip South Carolina quarterback Ryan Helinski, and while he did win the job for their first game, he eventually would get benched. In total, his stops at both Northwestern and Clemson were busts, and then he would enter the portal and return to Clemson to be a GA. He actually became the first Clemson player to ever go to the transfer portal under Coach Swinney, but again, he wasn't playing, he was going to be a coach. In total, in 4 seasons, Hunter Johnson had 1,100 yards with 7 touchdowns and 9 picks, and it'll be one of the biggest busts in recruiting history. Personally, the number 1 quarterback in the class of 2016 was one of my favorite players of all time in Jacob Eason. I thought he was marvelous at Georgia, and I did a video about 2 years ago on him that went pretty viral, and you guys should check it out. It's awesome, his story is great. But in short summary, Jacob Eason was always training to be a blue chip recruit, as his father ended up playing college football at Notre Dame, and eventually at Lake Stevens High School in Washington, Jacob would blow up. He was rated as a 5-star recruit, and ended up finishing with over 9,813 yards, 102 touchdowns, and 18 picks. He was ranked as the best pro-style quarterback in the class of 2016 and eventually decided to commit to Georgia. There was some concern though that he would decommit, as Mark Richt was now at Miami and Kirby Smart came in. Luckily, Jacob Eason would decide to stick with Coach Smart, and it would pay off. After losing a quarterback battle against Grayson Lambert, Eason was thrown into the Wolves and ended up making his first career start against Nicholls State. He then ended up leading them to a comeback victory over Mizzou, where he had that crazy pass to Isaiah McKenzie, and then also had a couple of other pretty awesome games that year. He threw one of the best passes I've ever seen against Tennessee, but ended up falling short because of that Hail Mary. In total in 2016, Eason would throw for 2,300 yards with 16 touchdowns and 8 picks. He had some highs and he had some lows. In 2017, Eason would end up playing in 1 game, but he would get hurt. His knee was done, and he was done for the year, and he was replaced. Jake Fromm at the time was a true freshman quarterback, and he ended up taking his spot, and Jacob Eason entered the portal. He ended up deciding to go back home, and he played for Chris Peterson in Washington. After sitting out 2018, he'd follow up Jake Browning and threw for 3,100 yards with 23 touchdowns and 8 picks, but Washington didn't really have that spectacular of a season. Eason went under the radar and entered the 2020 NFL Draft. Eventually, he was taken in the 4th round with the 122nd overall pick by the Indianapolis Colts and became the 3rd-string quarterback behind Phillip Rivers and Jacoby Brissett. In 2021, Carson Wentz became the new quarterback and he split time with Sam Ehlinger, but Eason became the backup and actually made his debut in relief of Carson Wentz. And what's weird is I was actually at this Colts-Rams game and I saw Jacob Eason's career end in a flash. After throwing a bad pass on 1st down, he threw an interception on 2nd down and he never saw the field again. From there, he spent time with the Seahawks, Panthers, and 49ers, and most recently, he was signed to the Green Bay Packers, but I don't think he's doing anything and is not on a team. While Jacob Eason will go down as somewhat of a what-if, I don't necessarily think you can call him a bust. He had a really good season at Washington, had brilliant moments at Georgia, and did get an opportunity to have a moment in the NFL. That's exactly what a number 1 overall quarterback is supposed to do, but yes, he was a little bit underwhelming. In the class of 2015, we have who some believe is the best quarterback in Texas high school football history, Kyler Murray. His dad was the legendary Kevin Murray, and eventually Kyler would arrive at Allen High School. While he was a little bit undersized, that didn't matter, as he ended up winning the Gatorade Football Player of the Year award in America and became the first player to be named Mr. Texas Football twice. He won 3 straight state championships, went 42-0, and put up insane stats. In total, he had 10,386 yards with 111 passing touchdowns. He also ran for 4,000 more yards and 69 touchdowns on the ground. After a highly entertaining recruitment, he would decide to sign with Texas A&M and play for head coach Kevin Sumlin, who had just managed to turn Johnny Manziel into a Heisman player. What's also funny is he was actually considered one of the top baseball prospects too, but obviously he would decide to play college football. As a true freshman, he competed with Kyle Allen for the starting job, and he would end up starting 3 games, throwing for 686 yards with 5 touchdowns and 7 picks. He would then decide to enter the transfer portal and would sit out a year in 2016. He went and sat behind Baker Mayfield for 1 year in 2017 at Oklahoma, but still got an opportunity to throw 3 touchdowns off the bench. Those 2 years off to prep ended up helping out Murray a ton, as in his 1 season starting with Oklahoma, he went 11-2, throwing for 4,361 yards with 42 touchdowns and 7 picks, and over 1,000 yards and 12 touchdowns on the ground. Murray ended up winning the Heisman Trophy and ended up becoming the number 1 overall draft pick to the Arizona Cardinals in 2019. So far, Murray's had a pretty good NFL career, you could say, as in 6 seasons now, he's thrown for 16,282 yards and 99 touchdowns. He's also ran for 2,600 yards and 26 touchdowns, and Murray has definitely lived up to the hype. While he has battled some injury issues over the last couple of seasons, he's still a really good player, and my goodness, this guy does deserve a documentary at some point. Another guy who could use a documentary for multiple reasons is Deshaun Watson. While nowadays he's talked about mostly for things that have nothing to do with football, Deshaun Watson was a major deal coming out of high school. He ended up going to Gainesville High School in Georgia, not to be confused with the city in Florida, and during his high school career, he became one of the best Georgia high school football quarterbacks ever. He ended up throwing for 17,000 yards, 218 touchdowns, and he ran for over 4,000 yards and 63 scores. Following in the lineage of Taj Boyd, a former blue chip recruit who went to Clemson, Deshaun Watson was the next man up and decided to commit to Clemson in 2012 and was the number 1 quarterback in the class of 2014. He had faith in Dabo Swinney, but at first, Cole Stout ended up being the starting quarterback. In retrospect, that was pure stupidity, but eventually Watson would take over, throwing for 1,500 yards and 14 touchdowns with 5 more on the ground in 2014. In 2015, Watson would burst onto the scene with over 4,000 yards through the air and 1,000 yards on the ground and nearly 50 combined scores as he got Clemson to the college football playoff. Ultimately, Watson would leave on a high note as he won a national championship with the Tigers, combining for nearly 5,000 yards and 50 scores as a senior, and left Clemson as one of the most decorated players in school history. He had over 10,000 yards, 90 passing touchdowns, and 2,000 yards and 26 scores on the ground. He was a projected first-round pick in 2017 and would eventually get taken with the 12th overall selection by the Houston Texans. Watson ended up having a very hot start to his career in Houston, as in his first 4 years, he was tremendous. His best season would come in 2020, as Watson threw for 4,800 yards and 33 touchdowns, but in 2021, he would not play due to some stuff that was going on behind the scenes. You guys already know what I'm talking about. In 2022, he'd be traded to the Cleveland Browns, where so far he's only appeared in 15 games in 3 years, throwing for just under 3,000 yards and a disappointing 18 touchdowns. Deshaun Watson's career is falling off, but at one point, he was a shining star for the Texans and was tremendous for Clemson while he was there. Nowadays, when people think of Christian Hackenberg, they think about Drew Allar. Those two get compared all the time, and what's interesting is on some sites, both of these guys were number 1 quarterbacks in their class, and both obviously went to Penn State. Christian Hackenberg had a tremendous story, as originally coming out of Virginia, he spent time at 2 different high schools, including time at Fork Union Military Academy, and due to him being nearly 6'5" and over 200 pounds, he was seen as one of those guys who could develop at the college level and eventually become an NFL franchise quarterback. He ended up committing to Penn State at a time when it wasn't popular to be a Nittany Lion due to all the scandal that had recently happened, but it didn't matter. He was the number 1 overall quarterback in that class, and he was going to help save Penn State. In 2013, he'd end up starting 12 games, throwing for 2,900 yards and 20 touchdowns. Hackenberg was off to a hot start, and honestly, he would regress over the next 2 years. His worst season would come in 2014, as he threw for 2,900 yards with 12 touchdowns and 15 interceptions. Hackenberg was just not able to really figure it out, and in 2015, he wouldn't really get all that much better. His passing yards went down to 2,300, and this time he did have 16 touchdowns, but he also had 6 picks. In total, in his 3-year career at Penn State, he finished with over 8,000 yards and 48 touchdowns, but honestly, he was very underwhelming. Still, though, because of his physical measurements, he was seen as a potential NFL quarterback and would decide to enter the 2016 NFL Draft, where somehow, someway, he was taken with pick number 51 in the 2nd round by the New York Jets. Ultimately, he would not really do anything for the Jets, as he literally did not play in a single NFL game and eventually went to the Alliance of American Football League. In 2020, he transitioned to baseball and tried to become a pitcher, and now he's a coach. Christian Hackenberg has a very interesting story, and while I did a video on him back in 2020, I might have to redo it, as he really does have an interesting career. In 2012, the number 1 quarterback according to ESPN was Jameis Winston. Winston ended up growing up in the state of Alabama and went to Hueyton High School. He became the number 1 quarterback recruit in his class after having a ridiculous football career there. Eventually, he would decide to ink his name with Florida State and head coach Jimbo Fisher, and was also selected in the 15th round of the MLB draft. In 2012, he would redshirt as he was stuck behind E.J. Manuel, but in 2013, Winston was named the starting quarterback, and he went absolutely crazy that year. He ended up leading his team to a perfect 14-0 record. He threw for 4,057 yards, had 40 touchdowns, and 4 more scores on the ground. He also ended up winning a national championship that season, and him and Kelvin Benjamin were a lot of fun to watch. He would return in 2014, and once again, Florida State would get back to the playoff. Winston ended up throwing for 3,900 yards, but this time had 18 interceptions, which was just way too much. Florida State was considered fraudulent for most of that year, but they would still make the playoff. Ultimately, they would get killed by Oregon 59-20, and Watson had that weird thing where he ran and dropped the ball and threw it in the air, and that was his only loss his entire time at Florida State. He would enter the 2015 NFL Draft and went with the number 1 overall pick. From there, he spent his first 5 years at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where he was known for putting up insane yards, but really struggled with turnovers and also didn't really win that many games. The only year in which he had a winning record was 2016, as the team went 9-7, and then in 2020, he went to New Orleans, where he then spent 4 more seasons. He only managed to break 1,000 yards in one of those seasons, as he was a backup, and now he's currently the backup for the Cleveland Browns. And what's really interesting is he's the backup to Deshaun Watson, who we just talked about, and there's a chance that he could be starting here soon. It's hard to say that Winston's been a bust because he has over 22,000 yards and 72 touchdowns to his name, but he also hasn't lived up to being the number 1 overall pick. Still, though, all in all, he won the Heisman, won a national championship, and has had a decade-long career in the league, so I can't really be that critical of him. Oddly enough, the number 1 overall quarterback recruit in the class of 2011 is still playing in the NFL as well, as his name is Jeff Driskel. Him and Jameis took very different routes to get here, though. Driskel would end up attending Paul Haggerty High School in Florida, and he was both a football and basketball star. During his high school career, he threw for 5,000 yards and 36 touchdowns, and ended up becoming the Gatorade Football Player of the Year and the number 1 pro-style quarterback in the country. He decided to commit to Florida and would join the newly hyped-up head coach Will Muschamp to try and salvage the Florida season. As while he did appear in 5 games in 2011, he only threw for 148 yards without a single touchdown. In 2012, Driskel got his shot at being Florida's guy, as he ended up going 9-2, throwing for 1,600 yards with 12 touchdowns and 5 picks. He was extremely underwhelming and would eventually do nothing over his next 2 years. He started 6 games in 2013 and 14 combined, and then would transfer to Louisiana Tech for his final year of eligibility. In that 1 year with the Bulldogs, he ended up leading his team to a 9-4 record and had over 4,000 yards passing with 27 touchdowns. Driskel was great at a lower level, and it was enough to get him drafted in round number 6 at pick number 207. His NFL career at this point has been really interesting. In 2016 and 17, he did nothing with the Bengals, but he would make 5 starts in 2018. He then started 3 games with the Lions, a game with Denver, went over to Houston in 2021, started 2 games with the Texans in 2022, started a game in Cleveland in 2023, and then this year he's currently on the Washington Commanders. Jeff Driskel is the perfect example of a guy who holds the clipboard, and there's no expectations on him when he gets in the game. Honestly, he's done it pretty well, as he's made millions of dollars, and honestly, it is a little bit hard to call him a bust. He had that great season at Louisiana Tech, and just like Winston, he's been in the NFL for nearly a decade as well, so I guess he ended up right where everyone projected him to be. But yeah, he was a little underwhelming. Finally, it's been a long video, we get to our last quarterback, and that is Phillip Sims. Man, quarterback recruiting was a lot different in 2010, as Phillip Sims was the #1 quarterback in the country, but wasn't even ranked inside the top 30 recruits according to the ESPN 300. He ended up going to Oscar F. Smith High School in Virginia, where he put up pretty crazy numbers there, and was seen as a dual-threat quarterback who could make it big at the next level. He would decide to commit to the Alabama Crimson Tide, and would sit out his true freshman season in 2010. He then became the backup to A.J. McCarron and only played in 8 total games. He was a part of the team that won the 2012 BCS National Championship, but then from there, he really fell apart. He transferred to Virginia in 2012 and was granted a waiver to play immediately due to his father's health situation. He ended up appearing in all 12 games but had minimal numbers, and then from there, he went to Winston-Salem State. That was all because he was ruled academically ineligible, and in total, he played in 11 games, throwing for 1,500 yards with 15 touchdowns. Okay, despite doing nothing at Bama, Virginia, and being at Winston-Salem State, he still somehow got a chance in the NFL. He ended up going undrafted and was invited to the Arizona Cardinals rookie camp, but was waived before the season began. In 2016, he tried out with the Seahawks, and then also in 2016, he was with the Saskatchewan Roughriders in the CFL. After not being able to make it work in the professional leagues, Sims ended up becoming the head football coach at John Marshall High School, and as of now, he's now the head coach at Princess Anne High School in Virginia Beach. While Sims was definitely a bust on the field, he did at least put himself to get a chance in the league, and is now having a successful coaching career, so A+ to him. So yeah, today we talked about what happened to every single #1 quarterback recruit since 2010, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I also hope you guys learned how bad ESPN's rankings are, as while some of them made sense, others didn't. But what do you guys think? If you're a fan of one of these players, let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know what other list or year or anything I should cover next. And before you go, don't forget to also leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and check out all of the videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.